Welcome to Skill Session. Today we're going to talk about MVC. It stands for Model View Controller, and it's one of the most widely used design patterns in web service development today. We're going to first take a look at the concepts and overall architecture of it. Then we're going to dive into an example setup, and then we're going to try and work with it a little bit just to see how we can work with an architecture like this. Let's jump into it. The concept is you want to visit a web service, so you jump into your browser, in this example Chrome. You type in a URL and the web service takes it from there. The web service picks up the URL in a router, and from the URL it knows what function to call inside of which controller. The controller then finds the data that you need in a model somewhere, and it sends that data out to the view, which can present the data in a beautiful way back to your browser. So what does that mean? We have the router component, and the router component is not really a strict part of MVC, it's just a good starting point. We have the controllers. The controllers are the centerpiece of MVC, and they're what binds everything together. So controller controls the flow of the application and how everything fits together. That also means that all functionality that doesn't have anything to do with that specifically shouldn't be in your controllers. Your models handle the data and the way that your application communicates with the database. So everything that's data driven, everything that has to do with the database, should generally go through the models. And your views decide how your application should look. So everything that has to do with the user interface should generally go into the view. So of course you might have something that's a little bit more complicated than that. So why do we do this? Well, we want to achieve separation of concerns. So you have your front-end developers. They're world-class champions at HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and whatever variants thereof you can find. So maybe they do Angular, maybe they do React, but that's the whole point. They do that stuff over in the views, and the other programmers don't have to deal with that. Then you have your database people and all your database functionality, and you have that down with the models. So best people for that job can work directly on the models. And then you have your backend developers, PHP developers, Java, C#, whatever you write your backend in, you throw them at the controllers and they can do all of their things in there. Now, they might need something else to actually do some functionality because the controller is primarily charged with binding the rest of the application together. So it might look at authorization, it might look at authentication, and it might look at the routes, it might look at models and views, but it shouldn't generally do anything. If you want to do something more specific than that, something that's not purely data driven, you might want to use a service. But the point that I want to make here is that by doing this, you can generally switch out an area relatively easy. So if you want to remove MariaDB and start to use another database, you only have to replace your models. The rest of the application will still work. If you want to stop working with pure HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and go into something like Angular, React, or Vue, or whatever is the front-end framework of the year, you can do that. You only have to replace the view, the controller, and the model will still work. Now, obviously, we'll often want to consume APIs, right? Please note on this slide that the two MVC setups here are upside down from each other. So the idea is, if we have our own system over here on the left, and we have another system that we want to use over on the right, then in our own system, we get the call into the router, we figure out what controller we want to call, we figure out what data we need from the model, and then we post that out into a service, because if we're working with APIs, then we're not really working with views. So we jump into this service where we want to call an API. Now that API call comes from our service and it goes into the router of the other system that has the API we want to call. Now that router figures out what controller and what function we need to call. It finds the data from the model, it might use other services, and then it responds with the data that we need. So a service can be used in a number of different ways. You might want to use a service if you have some form of an algorithm or some kind of functionality that you want to use or expose that's not a part of a model. Or you might want to use it if you're going to consume an API from another system. If you want to build your own API, you'll generally use your controller to build it and to decide how that's going to work, but it's often going to be data driven, so you can often just print out the stuff that you select from the database. So let's try out a simple example here that lets us understand how MVC works and how you bind things together in it. Now, I have two projects open In my workspace here in Visual Studio Code, I have dbadmin and MVC, and they're both available on GitHub. The link's in the description below. And if you don't know how to use GitHub, there's another video for that on my channel. I'll link that in the description as well. So what we want to work with here is MVC. So I take this folder, MVC, I can reveal that folder in my Finder, and I can start a PHP instance right inside that folder. And if I jump over into my browser, I can write localhost 8080, hit enter, and I'll see this beautiful page. And please remember that this is an educational framework. So this is built in order to help you understand the concepts, not for production. There's plenty of MVC frameworks out there that you can download, build on, and use for something for production, but they're generally more complex. This is simplified to help you understand the concept better. So work with this until you need something at a higher level, and then build it into something that's a little bit more finished. So we have a couple of things in here, and we want to figure out how all of this fits together so we can work. We know we started PHP in the base folder here called MVC. Let's just look directly inside of that folder because we know that PHP always looks for a file that's called index.php. But we also know that there's a way to manipulate how the PHP server works through these htaccess files. So let's take a look at what we have directly inside the MVC folder. We have a couple of things here. We have app, so that's the actual application. We have public, so that's the things that are going to be available for the public. Then we have a folder called install, and then we have htaccess and index. So in order to get everything to work, we started the PHP session inside of this folder, but I'm going to start another PHP session in this other folder on port 8081. Because inside of my install folder, I have this migrations file that contains the things that I need in order to get this project up and running. And I'll want to update this as I go along. But for now, let me jump onto localhost port 8081, and I have the opportunity to write some SQL code here. Now, this is rather limited because this is built on PHP PDO, so there's a bunch of security constraints in place. So if you're using this, then you need to do a couple of things. So I can jump in here to index, and I can decide here with these two lines if I want this to work with or without a database selected. So if I want to create a new database, I'll generally want to use line 24 instead of line 25. So I'll use this one. I'll jump over here, and then I can start running these lines. Drop database if exists, MVC, submit. Create database, MVC, submit. Now use MVC, I can't really do that here, so I'll have to go in here to index. So now that it exists, I'll use line 25 instead of line 24. I'll hit save, and I'll go into db config, and I'll make sure my db name is MVC. I can go back down here, and now I have the last one here, create table user, and I'll submit that, and now I have a database. And I can see that by saying show tables or describe user. Now, so I'm creating a user and I'm automatically giving them an ID. It's an integer, it's unsigned, auto increment, and it's the primary key. Then I have an email and a password, and the email, I want that to be unique and not null. If it's not unique, then someone creates a user with an email that already exists. I want to avoid that directly here on a database level. And then of course I have my password here that's also in a bar chart. So with that out of the way, we don't need dbadmin anymore. We don't need to install anything else. So let's focus on MVC. And we know that if we just go to the base URL of our PHP server, then it's going to look for a file called index.php. So all of this stuff that's loading down here should come from the file called index.php. We also know that the files called .htaccess can change the behavior of the PHP server. So let's take a look first at the index file. So the index file actually does very, very little. It starts a session if there isn't one. Then it requires a file called app/init, and then it makes a new router. And remember, we saw the router right before in the slides. Let's take a look at what this htaccess file does. It uses a rewrite engine, sets up a rewrite base for the base folder. What we're basically saying is that no matter what URL is typed in, you always want to look at the index.php. So how does that work? Let's take a look in the browser. If I say blah, 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 I'll still get to the same file. I can say 123/ whatever. Doesn't matter what I write here. You can see here that something happens with it, but it's the same page that loads. So let's take a better look at that. We were at the index.php file. This is going to call the app.init. App.init. And in here, we require the router and the database and the controller. Well, that makes sense because we need to require the router before we can create a new one, which we're doing down here. So we can look at that router, we can look at the database, we can look at the controller. Let's start at the router. This is the core of the application, and it has the router, database, and controller, and it also has something called dbconfig. And just before you go any further, make sure that you have the right username, password, and server name for your own database that you just set up right in here. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Anyway, let's look at the router. So there's a lot of comments in here just to try and explain what's going on. We're working inside of a class, and that class has a controller called home controller. It has a method called index, and it has an array of parameters that's empty. So why does it have that? Well, these are standard parameters. So if we're not hitting any other parameters, these will be used. So that's why I could write all of that gibberish before. So whenever I create a new router, the constructor is called first. And the constructor does a couple of things. It gets the URL as an array. That's a function down here. So how does that work? Well, it takes everything that goes between the forward slashes in the URL, and it turns that into an array. So if I say /blah, it'll turn that into an array where the first value is blah and the other one is blah from that URL. So that's what it does down here in get URL as array. So now that we have that, we can initialize a controller. That's a function down here. If the first parameter in the array that we just created is the name of a controller. So if I'm saying blah, then it's going to look for a file in the controllers folder that's called blah controller. And if there isn't one called blah controller, never mind, we'll just stick with the home controller. That's why we have the default values. So now we're either going to the blah controller or we're going to the home controller. We're going to the home controller because, spoiler alert, there is no such thing as a blah controller in this framework. Well, you can create one, but there isn't right now. So that's what we're doing down here. And the next function is very, very similar. So if there was a blah controller, it'll also remove that first part of the array and say, okay, so we used blah, we're not going to use that anymore. But if it isn't there, then it's still part of the array. So now we're preparing a function call because now we know what controller we're going to call. In this case, it's going to be the home controller. But if that first word was user, then it would go to the user controller instead, and we would remove the word user from that array. So we're preparing a function call, and it does more or less the same thing. It just figures out, well, in the controller that we decided on using, is there a function called whatever the first parameter of the array is? Remember, if the first parameter was the name of the controller, then that's been removed now. So the new first parameter will be the name of a function. And if that is the name of a function, well, then that's going to be the function that we call. But if it isn't, then we're going to call index because that's the default parameter up here. So what we're really trying to achieve is what we're saying here in the examples is that if we don't have anything, we'll call the index method on the home controller. If we say /user, then we're going to go to the user controller. But if we say /name, then we go back to the home controller because there's no such controller as a name controller. If we say /user/login, then we get to the login function of the user controller. But if we just say /login, then it would try and look for a login function inside the home controller. So we're using the first one as a controller if we can, and the second one as a method if we can. And then the rest is going to be used as parameters. So now that we know what the URL looks like, what controller we want to work with, what function we want to call, we need to figure out what parameters we want to call with it. So this line just takes the rest of those parameters and turn it into something that we can throw at the functions. And then we use this function down here, which does something that's called reflection. So it takes these strings and uses them as part of the application as if it was code. So we say call user func array, and we choose which controller we want to call. We set that up. Which method we want to call. We set that up. And what parameters we want to call it with. And that's what the router does. It just figures out what's inside the URL and where do we want to go from there. Now, there are different types of routers that you might run into in other systems. Some routers have a complete dictionary of where you want to go in what cases. So it might just have a full URL and then a controller and a function name that you want to go to from there. And you might have several versions inside of this to say, well, if you're logged in or if you have the rights to do this, then this is going to happen. If you don't have the rights, then that's going to happen. That whole setup can be put into a larger router where you have all your routes set up with what's going to happen when you reach that specific route. That's another way to do it. And there's a third way as well, where you do it annotation based. So with each function in your controllers, you would have an annotation before the function that would tell the router what route this controller is trying to work with. So that's kind of backwards way of doing it. But you're then just saying, well, I'm with my login function in my user controller, and I have an annotation that just says this function is going to be called when you reach the URL /user/login. So that's a third way of doing things. But right here, we're working with reflection. So we're just using the URL to directly select a controller and select the function and define parameters. So that means that we could actually take a look at what controllers we have up here and then start calling them from the URL. So we have an API controller, a home controller, and a user controller. Let's take a look at the home controller because that's the default one. So home controller has an index function, and this is what's called by default if we're not hitting anything else. We have two different functions. We have one that's called index and one that's called restricted. So that means that we can go out here and we can write home/index, and that should give us exactly what we have. Or we can say home/restricted, and it's gonna ask us to log in. So this actually redirected. And we can see that that's what happens down here, that if we're logged in, then it goes to the restricted site. If we're not, then it sends out a header that we're gonna be redirected to the user login site. Okay, but that was the restricted function. We wanna take a look up here at the index function because that's the one we've been calling. So let's just go back to the front page and take a look. We have a bunch of things in here, right? We have home controller index method, and we have something in here called a view bag. So we're working with an array that's called a view bag, and we're putting all kinds of things into it. So we're saying past, so that's the past parameters that we got up here. We're putting exactly 2 of them in here. So if there was more, we wouldn't be able to see it. And we're using default values of null up here. So if nothing was passed to these parameters, the function is still gonna work. Then we have something here called a math result where we're calling a service, and this is gonna be the math service. So there should be something here under services called math service. There we go. And that math service is going to, it adds a random number between 1 and 100 to the number that we pass to it. And that's one of the things that we have out here, right? So math result, 84. Hit refresh, 88. Then we have the view bag dog fact. That's the one we have down here, dog fact. It gets a new dog fact every time we hit refresh. This is a service that calls an API. This is a really simple API call that we use to just find the contents of this URL with file get contents. Then we decode the JSON and we find the fact object inside of what is returned. So we are actually consuming an API to do that in 4 lines of code in a place where we can easily find it. And then the last thing we have down here is model. In the home model, we're getting something from a function called xstring. But let's go down here into models and find the home model. And it says here xstring. So this is just gonna return whatever you pass to it after an x underscore. Now this is just a simple example just to show that you can call a model. This is not really what you would normally do with a model. A model would normally get some data from the database, and we have a more proper implementation in the user model. But let's stay where we are just for a little while longer and say, now that we've collected all of these things in the variable name viewBag, we call a function called view. We're inside of a controller. It extends the controller class. We collect some things in a view bag, and we then pass that view bag into a view. So this view takes 2 different parameters. It takes home and index. So that's going to look inside the views folder, inside home, and find index. So it's going to print out this view for the user, but it's going to give it the view bag. So if we look down here inside of this view, this is the HTML that makes up the page. It has a little bit of PHP in it, but we're in the views now, so we're looking at HTML. So we're jumping a little bit in and out of PHP, but we can see an H1 header. We have the different parameters all found in the view bag here. So we can actually access that view bag from the view here, but we can't access the rest of the application. This is what's been passed on to that view. And we can also see here, there's an example down here where we're taking out an image just to show how we can access our assets. So this comes down here from the public folder, public assets, fish. So in here, there's an image of a fish, and we can print that out. If we look at this page, it starts by saying home controller index method, and that's what we have up here. But there's a menu before that. There's a header and all these things. Where did that come from? Well, remember in the home controller, we are calling this function called view, and the home controller extends the controller. So inside the controller class in the core, we can find a function called view. So the controller does a couple of different things. It helps us to work with models, services, and views in different ways. Then it has something called method. This is a convenience method, and it has something called logged in to see if we're logged in. Okay, so let's take a look at these first 3 because that's basic MVC. So if we're calling a model, then we're going to go into the folder that's called models and look for a file called whatever the name of that model was going to be. And then we make a new one of those and we return it so we can call a function on it. The same goes for services, except it's going to append the word service to it. So up here, if I'm looking for a user model, then it's just going to look for a class called user. Down here, if I'm looking for a user service, it's going to look for something called user service, and that should be the class name as well. And down here in view, are we just looking for that view? Well, we're actually not. We're defining a variable that's called view path, and we're using the parameters to populate that string to say this is going to be the file that you want to show. But then we require something called views template. So in here, in views template, we have our basic HTML structure, but we're requiring a couple of things here. So we have something called partials/head inside of our HTML head section. Partials, head, and in here, well, we have our title that would go in the head section. We have a link to our own CSS file. That's the one down here, public CSS style.css, public CSS style.css. So in here, you can see that H1 headers are going to be red. Well, what do you know? The header is red. All of the other CSS is set up in here. Let's go back to the head section. We don't have any JavaScript in here because JavaScript should always be loaded as the last thing on the page. So if we look back at the template, the last thing on the page is going to be the footer, and we can open up the footer, and in here we're linking all of our JavaScript. So our JavaScript is inside public.js scripts, public.js scripts.js, and here we have some JavaScript, and this JavaScript is printing out to the console just the text my script. So does that mean if we say inspect, then it says my script out here? That's great. What else do we have in this template? Well, we also have a header, we have a menu, and then inside of that we have a container in a div, and here we load the view path. So that means everything that we have up here and everything that we have down here is always loaded. It also means that the views that we load always come inside of a container, and you can see the container is built to have a certain width. So all of that is set up, so whenever we define a view, we only define what's inside this white area right here. Everything else comes automatically from the template. Now we've seen a controller work, we've seen the services, we've seen a view, and we've looked at the template. Let's take a look at some of the things that we have in the menu here, because we had that site called restricted, and we have a link to it here, and it redirects us to the login page, but we can't log in because we don't have any users. It's not telling us that, it's just saying wrong username or password. So we'll go into register, we'll register a new user and click submit, and then we get to the login page, and now when we click submit, we actually get logged in, and this means that now if we click on restricted, it says congratulations, we can actually reach the restricted site, and we can log back out, and if we go to restricted, then it redirects us to the login page. So how does login work? Well, when we click on register, it goes to user/register. If we click on login, then it goes to user/login. Let's take a look. In our user controller, we have the functions register and login. We also have logout, and then we have something here called all users we'll get back to later on. So in register, it looks at whether or not we're posting, and it does the same for login. Why do we do that? Well, when I go to login, then I'm using a get method because it's just a link to a URL. That's always a get method. The same for register. So I can use that to say, if I'm using the get method, I just want the form. If I'm using the post method, inspect. If we look at the form, it's using the post method. So if I'm posting something, that means that I already used the form and I'm actually trying to register a user, or that I'm trying to log in. Then I'm setting a session here saying that I'm logged in. That's going to be true. And then I'm going to head over to the front page or to the default URL. And then later on, I can say log out, and that's just going to completely unset the whole session. But that doesn't matter, because if we go back into the index file, we're always going to start a new session if none exists. So it's just removing everything that it remembered from that session. But this is all using the model to work with the user. So let's take a look at that model. It's right here. Let's start with register, because that's the first thing that we do. So we get the email and we get the password from the input fields. So we get that in the post array. And we use this variable filters to make sure that this is not code being injected or anything. Then we hash the password because we never want to save a password as clear text in our database ever. And then we create some SQL. We don't have to make a connection or anything because that all comes from the database. And we just simply extend the database from all of our models. So we prepare this statement with this SQL. We bind a couple of parameters to it. We execute, and up here we then have the login function. But notice that we're only using the email address to pull something out of the database because we can't select something from its hash. So we're using the email address, binding that as a parameter, and then we're fetching that one user, and then we're using password verify. And this function itself already returns true or false depending on whether or not it was the right password. So we'll just return that. So we can register a user, and we can log in as that user. Great. And that also means that now we know how our model works. Now, this is kind of complex for our model, and we would normally want to clean this up quite a bit actually, and we can do two different things. One thing is we can create functions inside of our database that make some of these longer calls generic. I mean, this could be something that you just throw into a function and then call with a single function call every time. So let's try and extend that. You can see if we go into the core database, there's already one function in here that does something like that. There's already a get all. So you don't have to write these 3 lines to get everything from a table. You just have to call the get all function and the name of the table, and then you'll get everything back from it. So how could we work with that? Well, we could say that we want to protect it. So that means it can only be called from classes that inherit this one. Protected function select one, and we'll need a table, column, and we'll need a value. And then we'll return what we end up fetching, and then we can write some SQL up here. Select star from table where column equals colon value. And then we go down here and say that our value is going to be this value. So we're still using a prepared statement with bound parameters, but PDO doesn't support binding the table name or binding the column name. But as long as we don't get that from an external source, then we shouldn't have a problem. So let's save this, and then we can go over into our user and say result equals this select one, and then we needed our table, column, and our value, right? So the user table, the email column, the email. We should be able to log in once again, but with this 1 line of code instead of these 4. Which would clean up the code a lot when we're doing many of these. So let's try and log in. Database line 50 has a problem. Oh, we don't need that equals sign, sorry. Refresh, log in, and it says table $. There we go. Hit refresh and it's gonna post it again. And you can see we can actually log in and log out now. And we could use this 1 line to replace these 5 lines of code that we have down here. And that's just for this one function. When we do this again and again, we won't have to add anything to the database whenever we use this function. So that's a way to make things look a little bit cleaner. But the other thing that you might want to do is you could use what's called an ORM, or an object relation mapper. We're not going to go into that in this video. I'll make a separate video on that. But what it basically does is that it takes away all of these function calls so that you can just say what data it is that you want, and then it'll use the binding of data inside the database to figure out what it is that it should return for you. But since this is going to be focused on MVC, we're not doing that right here. The last thing that I want to show you in here is how to work with APIs. So we already consumed an API. That was super easy, right? We just went into a service. We had the dog service, and we're getting a fact from this API that provides random dog facts. So that's how we consume an API. But what if we want to build one? Well, we have an API controller up here, and it still extends the controller, but notice that we're not using the view down here, because then we're getting the whole template and everything, right? So we have a constructor in here because we only have a REST API. So we always want to use the header with the content type application JSON. And so we have an index function because just like every other controller, if we're not defining anything, then it calls the index function. And so I'm just using this as an excuse to inform our API consumers of what they have available inside of our API. Let's take a look at that. /API. Now it's being returned as JSON. That's why it has a completely different formatting. I'm using JSON pretty print, and it tells me that we have a URL named users that returns a full list of users. And it has something called user/I, which returns the info about the user with the user ID I. So let's take a look at that. /users. So we only have one user, and that user has user ID 4. Let's create another one. Register admin C, register admin X, API /users. And now we have all of these users. But we also had something that was just called user/ and then a number, and we have 4, 5, and 6. So let's use 5. And then we only get the information about user 5 because we have these 2 functions. We have the function called users, and we have the one called user, and user takes a parameter. So this means that this one's going to throw an error if we don't have a parameter because we're not setting a default parameter. And that's fine. That's what we want. We don't want people to call it without a user ID. So this one just goes into the model, gets that one user, and prints it out as JSON. And this one does the same, but it just gets all of the users. But it's still actually using the models to do this. It's just using this JSON instead of printing it out as a view. And that reminds me, let me show you one more thing from the views down. If we want to take a look at this whole list of users, we can actually do that. So if we just say /user/all users, then we have a list here of all of the users in a table. So if we go into the user controller and say all users, then we can see it goes into the model and says get users, and then it sends the view back to the user table. So if we go into user table, then we can see that there is a table here. This table is built to be generic. It looks at the users specifically, but that's the only thing here that's really specific. You could replace this with anything or nothing, and as long as you have table data from a table in your database or something that you joined, doesn't matter. As long as you're taking something out from the database, you could throw it into this function and just replace this parameter with whatever's correct for you, and it'll show you what's inside of that table. So let's try working with the MVC and build something new into it, right? We want to build something that has to do with goats. So let's create a goat controller, a goat model, and a goat view, just to get an idea of how we would work with this. First thing, we're gonna need a table that can hold the goats. I'll start inside my migrations file because I'll want to always keep this as part of my repository, so that when all of my collaborators need to work with the goats, they'll have the goat table available, because they can just run this whole file in their DB tool of choice, and they'll have a database that supports all of the functionality, right? Create table goat, and a goat is gonna have a goat ID, and then it's gonna have a name, it's gonna be a varchar, and it's gonna have a type of goat, and it's gonna have a birthday. And by default, you know, I'm probably gonna register my goats as soon as they're born, so I might as well make the birthday the same point in time that I'm registering them into my database. So now that I've written it here, it doesn't really exist, but I have the chance to work with it, so I can just copy it now, jump over into my database tool of choice, hit submit, I'll check that it works, describe goat, here we go. So that's perfect. Let's jump over into our controllers, because we need a goat controller. So I'll just take my user controller, I'll copy it, paste it, it's my goat controller. And I'll have to rename the class as well, otherwise I'm gonna get an error. So we could actually do something here. We could say that the index method for a goat is obviously gonna say blah. And then we'll want to have, well, a goat can't log in, right? They can't log out. We might want to say all goats. Yeah, sure. Let's keep a function that prints out all of the goats. That'll have to come from the goat model, and we'll say get goats. And then we're gonna have to make a goat view, and maybe we can use that table. We'll say goat all. Then we'll create a view called all inside the goat fold, and we'll create a goat model, because otherwise this is not gonna work. And register, we might actually want to register something, but let's write this from scratch, right? And we'll call it something different. Public function add goat. So when we add a goat, we need a form for it, and we need a way to register the input from that form. So if this method is post, that means we're getting something from the form. Else, we want to show the form. So when we want to show the form, this view goat add. And if it's already posting, then we want to do something with the model. So this model, and that's going to be the goat model, new goat. And we're not going to pass any parameters, because the model can take care of picking up the variables for this. It's not going to be a reusable function anymore. Remember, this is a post method, so it's not idempotent. So that means if someone posts a new goat and then hits refresh, they're going to post the same goat again. We don't want that. We want to make sure that every goat is new. We can't just add unique to it, because we might have multiple goats with the same name. So let's just put a header in here and use location /goat/add goat. That's going to go to the exact same page, because, you know, goats have a lot of babies at a time. So if I'm going to add 10 goats, it's going to be annoying if I go anywhere else. So I'll just add it to the form and then go. And then I can add a bunch of goats, right? And that actually means I'm just getting an idea. This is a crazy idea, but what if we make all of this on the same page, right? Add goat right here. Maybe we want two different versions of this, but I want this to happen in both places. If I just want a list of goats, maybe I want to see it, because if I'm adding a lot of goats at the same time, then I can see that they're actually being added to the list without having to check it. So we'll make that part of this page. And now I think we have everything that we need as far as the controller goes. So let's add a goat model. Once again, I'll just copy one of the existing models, copy, paste, rename goat, and then inside of it, I need to say goat here as well. Let's write everything from scratch here. So let's figure out what we can do with these goats. Well, we already had the goat controller, and we already have a couple of functions. We had new goat and get goats. New goat and get goats. and these are both public functions. We'll open them up and say get goats. I think we had something in the database that made this easier. So let's take a look. Core database. We had something here called get all from a table. That's going to be super easy. Go up here inside of my goat here and say get goats. Say this get all goat. There we go. Oh, and we need to return it. So when we get a new goat, we're going to expect to get something in from a form somewhere, right? We're going to expect a name from the post array. Name. We're going to expect a type from the post array. Now we should filter these. Hit save, and then we need to put them into the database. Insert into goat, name, type, values, name, type. I have my connection, so I can prepare this SQL, and I'll call that a statement. Then I'll bind my parameters, and with that bound, I'll execute it. And since I'm just putting something into the database, there's nothing to return here. So I'll hit save, so that's the controller, and that's the model. We need the view. So let's look at the controller. What was the view? We wanted to make a view that was called goat add. Inside views, we need a new folder, goat. And inside of that, we need a new file that was called add.php. Well, let's make a header for good measure. We want a form. We want to post it. And the action, start with a / to get the base URL, /goat /add goat, right? Goat controller, add goat. Yes. And we'll finish that form, a label for name, write name in it, and an input that has the ID and name. We can put this in a div, and then copy it for the type, and then make a button of type submit. And we'll say create inside of that, hit save, and I should be able to go over here and say goat /add goat. And this is the view that I just created, right? And so we're getting this because inside the get controller, we're going to add _ goat, and we're not using a post function right now. We're using the get method. So let's try and create a goat. Mike, he's a mountain goat. Create. Let's see. Select star from goat. And now we have Mike is a mountain goat. But I wanted to have that table underneath here. I had something beautiful inside the user here, right? I had the user table, and I bragged about how generic that was earlier on. So let's just put that in here. Here we go. And then say, what did we do in the controller? We said this model goat get goats. That's going to be in users. Oh, that's not right. Goats. Same down here. Goats. So up here in add, I'll just say that look at the goats. Don't look at the users, look at the goats. Here we go. And I'll hit refresh. There's an error. And the problem is that we're not adding the view back to the view. So let's do that. So refresh. And now we have the goat here, and we can just add Anna, mountain goat. Johnny. I'm sorry, I don't know any other types of goats. Mountain goats. And so that's it. I think this is enough that you can get a sense of how this works and how you can bind things together and how you can create more with it. We've looked through the framework. We know how everything works. We know how we use the router to look at the URL. Jump into a controller, find a function. Then that controller is going to look at the models, at the services, and it's going to create a view, or it's going to post something in an API, whatever it is. It's all bound together by that controller. We've added something to this. When we cloned the repository, we had a user controller, we had a user model, and we could already log in and log back out. And we had a restricted section that we could only see when we were logged in. But now we've added goats to it. So we have goats. And we can take a look at those, we can add them, all that beautiful stuff. I hope this can help you get an overview of what exactly MVC is and how it works and why it's so powerful, how we can use it to really truly separate concerns and find our way around an application even as it grows and even explodes in size. You can have an application of hundreds of thousands of lines of code and you'd still know where to go to figure out how something works. Well, something's wrong when I go to this site. Okay. Let me take a look at the URL. That tells me what controller I'm going to be looking for and what function I'm going to be looking for. And that's then going to tell me the recipe for this exact call. So am I looking for a view? Am I looking for an API? Am I looking for a model? What model am I looking for? And what services am I looking for? And all of that's bound together by the controller. So with all of that out of the way, this was a big one, but it was today's skill session. See you in the next one.